Welcome to Mr. Marr's Modern Studies Help. In today's episode, we will be discussing the National 5 Modern Studies exam and looking at how to answer conclusions questions. There are two types of questions in a Modern Studies exam at National 5. You have knowledge and understanding, which is based on the content you've learned in class and how well you can repeat this and show your knowledge. And there are inquiry skills questions, which involve you using your answer based on the sources that are given in the exam. Today's lesson, focusing on conclusions questions, is drawn from the inquiry skills section. Let's discuss some background information about conclusions questions. Conclusions questions will be worth 10 marks. The purpose of these questions is to ask you to summarise key features of the evidence that you're given based on topics that you have to discuss. You will get 3 sources of information in your answer, and you must use all 3 if you want to get full marks. You will also write 4 conclusions based on the 4 topics which are given in the exam. Let's discuss how you can get marks for this. As has been noted, conclusions questions are worth 10 marks. You can get 1 mark for each time you give a relevant and valid conclusion statement based on the topics that were identified in the exam paper. You can also get a further 2 marks for providing evidence from the sources to support each of these conclusion statements. Let's discuss how you can answer the question. You should start off by reading the first statement that you must comment on, and then give a conclusion for this. In simple terms, this means a summary. For instance, it might include discussing the fact that something is the biggest or smallest, increasing or decreasing, has a major impact or no impact, and so on. Once you've done this, if you do so correctly, you will gain your first mark. You should then try to give at least 1 piece of evidence to support this conclusion from one of the sources. And you can gain a second mark in terms of your evidence, although a third mark overall, if you try and synthesize. This means provide a second piece of evidence that supports your conclusion. If you've done this successfully, then so far you will have 3 marks, 1 for your conclusion and 2 for supporting pieces of evidence. If you can only find 1 piece of source evidence that supports your conclusion, you can write a 2-part conclusion and then provide a piece of source evidence that supports each part of this. You should then repeat this process for the other 3 conclusions topics. Doing so will enable you to gain the full marks. Remember, don't repeat evidence. Once you've used the fact from a source, you shouldn't keep going back to this as part of your work. Let's look at an example question which is drawn from the Democracy in Scotland topic. This asks you to draw conclusions about Scottish Parliament election results. You can see here the 4 topics that you have to base your conclusions upon. And remember, as part of this, you've got to use evidence from the 3 sources. In this case, source 1 is based on text and a table of information, source 2 is based on graphs, and source 3 is a combination of graphs and a table of information. You should begin by discussing the first of the conclusions topics which are required. In this case, it was about the impact of trade unions. You should give a conclusion about this, and if you do so successfully, you'll get your first mark. Then you should look at the sources and identify why it was you came up with this conclusion. Source 1 identifies some information, and source 2 has some other relevant points which help in our answer. We've gained our first mark for giving our conclusion. Remember, that's simply a summary. Now we can get a second mark for supporting this with evidence from the sources. If we know another piece of evidence which will help us in our answer, we can refer to this. And when we look at the facts, we can actually see that there are further information which is relevant to trade unions. By adding in this third point, we have gained our third mark. 1 mark for our conclusion and 2 marks for supporting pieces of evidence. We then turn our attentions to the second issue on which we need to give a conclusion. We give our conclusion or summary. We then read the sources and identify relevant facts and information. And once we have done this, we can add in our knowledge, which helps us gain our 5th and our 6th mark. We then turn to the third conclusion. Again, we give a statement which summarises the issue. We look at the sources and identify relevant pieces of evidence, and we can add in this information, giving us our 7th and our 8th mark. We look and see if there's any further information, which we can do, and this helps us when we come to write our 4th conclusion. We then support this with information from our sources. In summary terms, let's look at our answer. We write a conclusion for our first topic, and we support this with up to 2 pieces of evidence. We then write a conclusion on our second topic, and again we support this with up to 2 pieces of evidence. A conclusion on our third topic follows, along with 2 pieces of evidence which supports this, and finally we write a conclusion on our fourth topic, and we again support this with up to 2 pieces of evidence. By doing so, you can see here that there are 10 sentences and 10 marks. National 5 Modern Studies exam, how to answer conclusions questions. It's really that simple.